to In the Margins, and I'm your host, Ralph Newell. Today we have with us Dr. Carol Anderson, the Robert W. Woodruff Professor of African American Studies at Emory University, and author of White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, which was a New York Times bestseller. Welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you so much for having me, Ralph. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. But before we, kind of jump into things, I'd like to hear a little bit about your background. Tell us where you're from and what led you to where you are today. How did you get into history and wanting to become a professor, et cetera?
I grew up in Columbus, Ohio.
Okay.
My sense of injustice started early, started early. And my love of politics started early. And so that sense of injustice came from my father was in the military for over 20 years. When he got out, we moved to Columbus, Ohio. And my mother had found this house that she really loved on Oakland Park Avenue. And the realtor was like, no, that's not where you people live.
Mm,
And so
mm.
I'm like, well, who might you people be?
Right,
uh,
right.
right. So it was that you people who fought against the Nazis in World War II, those you people.
Mm-hmm.
So where we lived, we moved into an area called Linden. And Linden was one of those areas of massive white flight. And it was like watching the massive disinvestment that was happening in Linden and watching my father fight the city and organize the community to try to stabilize Linden. That's where a lot of my sense of the kind of systemic injustices come from, was watching what was happening as I was growing up. And also under the backdrop, there was the civil rights movement, there was the Black Power movement, and there was Vietnam, and there was Watergate. So all of that is swirling around me as I'm growing up.
Wow, wow. So how old were you at that time? 'Cause it just caught my ear there that you actually remember the street what the house was on.
Um, I was I was a young child, a young child. I don't remember how young,
Okay.
but young enough to know that something was wrong. And then as the stories kept getting told, just young enough to be just angry at that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, it's sort of ironic that you say you're just noticing things that were going on around you. My oldest daughter is a history major, history econ major, and not that our experience was similar, but she says the same thing, just about what's going on in the community really piqued her interest about learning the roots of it, what was the cause. And
exactly.
so
How did
uh,
we get here?
exactly what she says. Yeah, so I could imagine a conversation with you just like with her. I just learned so much. But today I really wanted to, sort of get into elections, that this upcoming presidential election and voter engagement, in particular, engagement with our youth of color, African Americans and Latinos in particular. So, all of what you just said, the Vietnam War, civil rights, all of that. I mean, that was a turbulent time. Especially with the Voting Rights Act going on at that time, people wanting to vote, especially the youth. But we seem to have a challenge in some regards in getting the youth out. So, what are the key challenges in getting youth of color to engage in the electoral process today?
I think it's multi-pronged.
Mm-hmm.
One of those are the kind of structural impediments that states have put up to block students and to block young folk from voting. So, like voter IDs, and so you have these states that say your student ID from a college or from a state college or university doesn't count as a government issued photo ID. You have them moving polling places off of college campuses, and then putting the nearest polling place for that precinct off of the public transportation line. And so
Mm-hmm.
students will have to like leave campus. And remember, it's on a Tuesday, leave campus and go to that polling place. And it's going to take a bit, it's going to take some time. So they're probably missing classes in the process of doing that. And so so when these jurisdictions create these obstacles, these impediments, that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is a system that really doesn't feel responsive to their needs, really responsive to their vision of what is important. And so when they do vote, there is this expectation that they will see change. but change is so incremental, or change is blocked. And so part of it is just knowing the ways that civics works. So that you may have a Democratic president, but if you have a Republican Senate or a Republican House of Representatives, being able to get legislation through is really doggone difficult. And it's also then understanding that there's things that we pay so much attention to the presidency that we don't really pay attention to what's happening at the local level. So we expect the president to be able to handle the massive police brutality that rains down on Black and brown folk. That's not the president's job. What we need to be paying attention to is the mayor who's on our city council, what is happening in our boards of our county commissioners. Those entities have so much say in what's happening in our criminal justice system. It's also paying attention to who our judges are, because we can elect our judges. And so knowing who they are. So it is an information piece. It is watching how the system doesn't move, and so it feels futile. And it is watching also massive voter suppression, because the other thing that voter suppression is designed to do is to make you think it's futile, that your vote doesn't matter, your voice doesn't count. But here's the big but in all of this. That generation is the largest demographic in the United States right now. If they voted at the same level, same turnout level as the baby boomers, it could be transformational. Because politicians have to pay attention to the voters. And so when you have that massive group coming out voting, then they have to pay attention to gun safety legislation. They have to pay attention to criminal justice reform. They have to pay attention to climate change. They have to pay attention to voting rights. They have to pay attention to reproductive rights. They have to pay attention to LGBTQ rights. But when that group is not there, then the focus is on the folks who are casting the ballots and what their priorities are.
Yeah. No, voter suppression. I mean, that's a big one, and I do want to talk more about that just a little bit later here. But when we think about the young voters and getting them out to vote, so we talked about some of the suppression issues that you talked about in regards to they can't get to the polling places, for example. But are there other historical factors you think that still resonate with young voters today that are preventing them from going to the polls?
I think that one of the things is part of what we know. I mean, the research is clear, is that when there is a history of voting, that gets replicated. Just the way a history of not voting gets replicated. So if you're in a community that doesn't vote, that voting isn't part of the way of being, it's not a norm, it's not expected, then that becomes really logical in the way to do it, that you just don't vote. And so if you're in these communities that have been suppressed, and so there's research out there, for instance, that shows that in communities that have experienced a lynching, that voter turnout, Black voter turnout, is much lower than it is in other communities that have not experienced a lynching. And so if you're in those communities and you have that history, then that becomes part of your way of being. And so that's part of what we have to recognize, how voting is habit forming, as is non-voting is habit forming.
No, you're right about that. Yeah. So how can, community organizations or the universities themselves contribute to getting the youth vote out?
Community organizations are wonderful because they go where the folk are, and they don't say, "Oh, you must vote." They start talking with people. They start asking, "What do you want? What would make your life better? What would provide you with the wherewithal to live your dreams?" And when they start talking to folks starts talking about, "Oh, I would love to be able to afford to go to college. I would love to be able to have really good schools. I would love to be able to not get sick and to be able to have good, affordable health care. I would love to be able to get into a really good training program and a really good apprenticeship program so I can make really good money. I would love to be able to buy a house. I would love to be able to," as people start talking about what they would love to be able to do, then those grassroots organizers start linking up what those freedom dreams are with the public policies that can make that possible. And the way to get that public policy in place is part of that way is through the ballot box. And so it is like listening to what people want and need, and then linking it up with the power of the right to vote. The other thing that we see college campuses doing are setting up like registration tables on their college campuses, on their quads, so students can register to vote, and getting the information out to those students about how do you register to vote? When is the registration deadline? And so one of the key pieces back in the 1970s, so, this is the historian, back in the 1970s, the 26th Amendment was passed, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. And that was because of the Vietnam War. Because if you're old enough to fight, you have to be old enough to vote.
Right.
Well, in Texas, in Prairie View, Texas, in Waller County, a man named Leroy Sim, who was the one who handled voter registration, there was a really incredible HBCU there, Prairie View. And he did not want those Black students from Prairie View voting. And so the registration went, well, if I know you and your family, then yes, you get registered to vote. Or if you're on the property list, then you get registered to vote. But if you're not, then we're going to ask you some questions. Do you own property? Now, what 18-year-old do you know owns property?
Right.
In Prairie View, Texas, right? So this is how he was blocking young Black students from registering to vote. That case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in a decision called Sim versus United States, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that college students have the right to vote where they go to college. That was a landmark ruling. And so that is what gives the permission structure, what allows these colleges and universities to register college students to vote where they are and say, you have the right to vote here, because you're basically here for 9 months out of the year.
Yeah. That's true. It's interesting you say that, because I have several family members in college right now, but just specifically a nephew at North Carolina A&T and a niece at Spelman, and I just happened to see them both this past weekend, and they were talking about, oh my gosh, they were getting voter overload at school. So many people on campus trying to get them to register, but they were going to vote absentee, up here. And I'm an election officer, during elections, and one of the things I have seen happen a lot. And now what you're just saying is now explaining it to me, that a lot of kids register to vote at college, and then they come home to vote, and then they're not on our rolls because they've been registered somewhere else. And it's interesting because now they think we are taking them off the rolls, but not realizing they registered somewhere else.
Right. And so that is where also part of the kind of information piece has to happen, the kind of civic education component about, if you're registered, for instance, you're at Spelman and you register in Georgia to vote, then you can't be registered up in New York.
Right.
Because and this is also where so you said North Carolina A&T. One of the big voter suppressor things that happened at North Carolina A&T was when they were drawing the maps, the congressional maps, because North Carolina A&T is the largest HBCU in the nation.
Right.
The state looked at that, the state legislature looked at that and said, oh my God, can you imagine all of those Black students voting? Oh, that's a problem. That's a problem. They can get the kind of congressional representation that could be a big problem for us, the legislative representation. So what they did was they drew the maps, the legislative maps, and they cut the campus in two. So one part of the campus is like in Congressional District 4, and the other one is in a different congressional district. And so what that does is then, so you've got this campus that then that power of that Black vote is then diluted into the larger white rural county. So, and the same thing happens with the other district. So there are these shenanigans that get played, and they always look logical and reasonable until you look at them and you're like, man, what are you doing?
Right, right.
What are you doing?
Can you I wasn't even going here, but now that you're saying that, can you talk a little bit about and forgive my naivete here, not knowing, but I know recently, when I say recently, in the past, what, 10, 15 years, um, states that were under review for their district drawing, they no longer have that federal oversight. Um, what has been the impact of that now in districts? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, it has been massive. It has been massive. So there were states that were under the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance provision, which was
Right.
Section 4, which meant if you were under Section 4, it meant that you had a history of discriminating against your minorities by trying to block their access to the ballot box. And so you had to get all of your election laws okayed first by the U.S. Department of Justice or by the federal courts in D.C. Once the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Shelby County v. Holder that Section 4 didn't count anymore. Section 4 was unconstitutional. Section 4 was a relic of a bygone era, no longer necessary. Then it released these states, these pre-clearance states, like Georgia, like
Hmm.
Alabama, like Mississippi, like Texas. It released them from that pre-clearance provision. So now they could do what they wanted to do. And so then it required then massive litigation from folks like the ACLU, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, to take these places to court for the mess that they were doing. So
Hmm.
the impact, for instance, the Brennan Center has found that in these Section 5, they're called Section 5 states, jurisdictions, is
Hmm.
that they have closed almost 1,700 polling stations.
Wow.
And they were able to close them without getting the okay from anybody. They could just close them. And like here in Georgia, the bulk of the ones that have been closed, over 200 have been closed. The bulk of them have been in Black communities and poor communities.
Wow.
The other thing that has happened are these massive voter roll purges,
Hmm.
where they're just wiping folk off the rolls, and they're doing so under the guise of voter roll maintenance. Well, you don't
Hmm.
want all these dead people on the rolls. Well, you don't want all the people who have moved out of state on the rolls. Again, it sounds so logical, except where they're perseverating, where they're honing in on are folks who don't vote regularly, because the
Hmm.
U.S. Supreme Court gave them the right to do that in a decision called Husted versus the A. Philip Randolph Institute,
Hmm.
which violates, because what was happening, the National Voter Registration Act, the motor voter law,
Right.
says that you can remove folk off the rolls if they die. You can remove folks off the rolls if they move out of your jurisdiction. You cannot remove folks off the rolls simply because they haven't voted regularly. But what these jurisdictions were doing was that they were removing people simply because they hadn't voted regularly.
Hmm.
And who doesn't vote regularly? Young people, poor
Right.
people, and minorities. And
Right.
so in Ohio, for instance, the Secretary of State had removed 2 million voters from the rolls. 1.2 million were because they hadn't voted regularly. 25% of those removed came out of Cuyahoga County alone.
Okay.
Cuyahoga County that has Cleveland.
Cleveland, exactly.
What they also found was that in communities that were predominantly Black in Hamilton County, African Americans accounted for like 10%. 10% of African Americans in a precinct, in an area, were removed, while only 4% of whites in the suburbs were removed in Hamilton
Hmm.
County. So that's the kind of disparity that you have with these voter roll purges. And so this is how it's a targeted hit, but it
Hmm.
doesn't look targeted on its surface. It looks race neutral on its surface.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Before I digress there, you were talking about civic education to empower young voters of color. We were talking about when we were talking about registering students to vote on campus. Are there any other models that you think should be expanded or that exist that can improve civic education for young voters?
absolutely. What North Carolina used to have before the Shelby County v. Holder decision came down
Mm.
and the legislature flipped and created what they call the monster bill, What they used to have was that 16 and 17-year-olds were pre-registered to vote. So those in high school were getting the kind of civic education and getting the kind of being used to being a voter, being a voter.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they immediately turned 18, they were automatically registered to vote. That was absolutely a dynamic way of engaging young folk early on. And so Oregon does that, and California does that. North Carolina, once the Republicans took over, they went, no, we're not doing that. And they ended that pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
But that is just a really dynamic, important model, because when you're in high school, you're getting all of this information through, and that is where you can get some of that civic education. That's where you can get some of that history about how we got here. And then when you turn 18, you understand how we got here. You understand the power of the vote, and you're automatically registered to vote. One of the other pieces that has been really good, because like you have the National Voter Registration Act that does the motor voter law. So when you're getting your driver's license, you can get automatically registered to vote, and that's good. But one of the things that they began to understand, were that not everybody gets a driver's license. There's a racial disparity in access to a car. So not everybody gets a driver's license. And so they started opening it up to other public agencies where, so if you are getting housing, if you are hitting not Social Security, if you're hitting social services, those agencies can get you registered to vote. And so the power of that, having access to registration, is so important. Having these multiple vectors in places where, because again, when it becomes normative, when it becomes, okay, this is what we do, this is how we roll, this is who we are voters, it becomes like, yeah, I got this. Yeah.
Okay. Now I do want to move into the voter suppression that we were touching on a little bit earlier, and I wanted to have you talk a little bit about your book that I mentioned in your title, White Rage. And first, two things. First, I wanted you to define what white rage means, and then after that, what has it meant to our political process in the past 10 to 15 years?
So let me do a quick history on how I got to white rage.
Okay.
I'm watching television, and Ferguson, Missouri is blowing up. I mean, it is on fire. Folks are just furious about the killing of Michael Brown, and just leaving that young man's body there on the asphalt for hours upon hours. Folks are like, no, we're not having it. So I'm watching television, and it didn't matter which channel I had on, CNN, MSNBC, or Fox. They were all saying the same thing. Look at all that black rage. Look at black folks burning up where they live. Who burns up where they live? And I said, I lived in Missouri for 13 years. I was like, that's not black rage, that's white rage. And I went, oh. Because what became so clear to me, and I said, we are so focused in on the flames that we ignore the kindling. And the kindling are those policies that systematically undercut African American citizenship rights.
Right.
And so every time that African Americans make a major advance towards their citizenship rights, there's a massive policy backlash. That's what I'm calling white rage, that massive policy backlash to undermine that advancement. So we see it after the Civil War, when you're getting the U.S. Supreme Court gutting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the Force Acts and the Enforcement Acts. That leads us then into Jim Crow, because the structure of citizenship that the radical Republicans had put in place just got eviscerated by the courts via public policy. And you saw the rescission of 40 acres and a mule, right? So the kind of economic wherewithal that the enslaved needed, that the freedmen needed in order to be able to fully embrace their freedom, got removed. Policy backlash. So yes, we think of the violence as rage, but the policies are real rage, because they affect millions upon millions of African Americans. The same thing with the Brown decision. You saw with the Brown decision, that was that major advancement of ending Jim Crow. And you saw the states shut down their public school systems, and you saw them just basically going, oh no, and figuring out ways how to make sure that white children were educated and Black children were not. A way to get around the Supreme Court decision of Brown. What we're
Mhm.
seeing politically in the past 10 to 15 years, one of the things that I chart in White Rage was the election of Barack Obama. Because that election of Barack Obama, so part of what you hear is, oh, look at us. We crossed the racial Rubicon. Did you see what we just did? We put a
Mhm.
Black man in the White House. Wow, aren't we something? And so all of this patting on the back, what that is saying is the majority of whites are proud of themselves because they put a Black man in the White House, except that's not accurate.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
majority of whites have not voted for a Democratic candidate for president since 1964,
Okay.
since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. And the majority of whites in America did not vote for Barack Obama. So you might ask, how did this Black man get in the White House? He
Mhm.
had an incredible ground game. And that ground game, that grassroots mobilization went into communities where you did not have vast voter registration, and they registered millions of people to vote. They were overwhelmingly African American, Asian American, Latino, young, and the poor. That would become the hit list for voter suppression. So when you think about it, Obama is elected in 2008. Mitch McConnell said, my goal is to make sure he's a one-term president. Then he gets reelected in 2012. In 2013, you get the Shelby County v. Holder decision that
Mhm.
guts the Voting Rights Act. And these states then hit the wall, really, hit that opening really quickly, like a running back going, where the O-line has just opened up and they hit it. And so within 2 hours, Texas implemented a racist voter ID law after the Shelby County v. Holder decision. Alabama wasn't too far behind. Um, and
They
so
were already ready then.
they were ready. They had the stuff drafted. They were ready.
Mhm.
They were ready. Um, and and so one of the things about Texas's voter ID law, it said that if you have a student ID from a state college or university, that is not a state issued voter ID. It is not acceptable to be able to vote. But your gun registration card is.
Hmm.
Now, there's a racial
Wow.
dynamic be underneath
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
50% of those in the state colleges and universities in Texas are folks of color.
Hmm.
80% of the gun registration card holders are white. So if you're
Hmm.
able to craft your electorate by crafting a racial dynamic there and also crafting an ideological dynamic,
Wow.
yeah,
Wow.
you can work magic. So in Alabama, what Alabama did, Alabama said, okay, you must have a government issued photo ID to vote, but your public housing ID doesn't count.
Mm.
Now, does it get more government issued than public housing?
Right.
Right.
Okay.
But in Alabama, 71% of those in public housing were African American.
Hmm.
And for many, it was the only government issued photo ID that they had. And so
Wow.
if you're able to take that large group of folk and just wipe them off of the electorate, you are being able to change what the election outcomes will look like in Alabama. Then Governor Bentley, listening to his mistress, shut down, you can't make this crap up, shut down the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt counties.
Wow.
And said he was doing it in order to balance the state budget, to be fiscally responsible, because those units weren't getting a lot of traffic through them. And so he looks like he's the king of good governance, when in fact it is a targeted hit on the voting rights of African Americans. Because what that did is it made the ability to go vote, to get the driver's license, it put it 50 miles away. So if you don't have a driver's license, how do you go 50 miles to the nearest driver's license bureau?
Hmm.
And Alabama's ranked 48th in the nation in terms of public transportation. So if you don't have public transportation and you don't drive, how do you get the license that you need in order to vote?
Right.
What they did in North Dakota, you can't make this mess up. What they did in North Dakota was that state legislature looked at the indigenous population and
Hmm.
said, you must have a physical address on your government issued photo ID in order to vote. 61% of indigenous people in North Dakota lived on reservations.
Mm-hmm.
Reservations don't have physical addresses. They've got the P.O. boxes. So it just wiped out 61% of indigenous people in North Dakota. They looked up and said, son, you don't know my name. My name is the wrong one. And so what they did, they started getting GPS and Google Maps and
Mm-hmm.
printers and figuring out what people's physical addresses would be. They started melting printers because they were printing out these IDs with physical addresses on them so fast.
Right, right. Wow.
But this is how this is part of what we're seeing with the removal of the feds being able to look at what these states are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're seeing this kind of targeted hit at minority voters
Right.
um, because and this is a partisan thing. So yes, both parties actually do gerrymandering, no doubt
Mm-hmm.
about it.
Mm-hmm.
They don't do it at the Democrats don't do it nearly to the degree that the Republicans do it.
Mm-hmm.
But the Democrats are not doing voter ID laws
Right.
because those voter ID laws are based on the lie of massive rampant voter fraud.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
we've got all of this fraud. We've got all of these dead people voting. We've got people coming in disguises voting. We've got people using dogs' names voting. That's not happening. That's so not
It's
happening.
not. And as an election official, at least in the state of Virginia, I can tell you it's not in my jurisdiction. But yeah,
It's not happening.
it's amazing
Yeah,
what's
but
out there.
that lie of voter fraud becomes the foundation
Mm-hmm.
for all of these measures, for all of these measures about voter ID and certain types of voter ID, just to make sure we've got election integrity, that we're keeping we have the purity of the ballot box. Justin Levitt did a study. He's a law professor out of California, and he found that from 2000 to 2014, there were 1 billion votes cast in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Out of those 1 billion votes cast, there were 31 documented cases of voter impersonation fraud.
Right.
So over a 15-year period, 31 cases out of 1 billion votes. You do the
Mm-hmm.
math
Mm-hmm.
on that, and the percentage is like 0.000000000,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
right? And but that becomes the foundation of these voter ID laws, which, for instance, in Wisconsin, the state targeted Milwaukee, particularly targeted Milwaukee, which is where 70% of the state's Black population lives.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So they moved the driver's license bureaus basically to the outskirts of Milwaukee and off of public transportation routes. And the impact of that was in 2016, scholars did a study and they found that 8% of whites were not able to vote in the election because they didn't have an ID. 27% of African Americans were not able to vote because they didn't have an ID. Yeah.
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 You definitely have identified and laid out the white rage as it relates to our election system. How can we identify and address other systemic forms of this backlash in areas like education, housing, the criminal justice system?
And so when you see gains, so one of the things that I talk about in White Rage
Mm-hmm.
is after the civil rights movement, African Americans had made enormous gains in terms of going to college because you had the Pell Grants and you had a much better admission system. So you had these places like Texas who used to say, "Nah, if you're black, you're not coming here." Who were like, "Okay,
Mm-hmm.
okay, fine, fine, fine. You've got the grades, you've got the scores. Come on, right?" The impact of that was amazing. What happened when Reagan came to power is that you have a shift in the student financial aid packages
Mm-hmm.
so that you've got an over reliance now on loans and less reliance on grants. And so it made going to, and you started having states basically withdraw funding from their state colleges and universities, so the tuition was going up.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a population that has dealt with systemic inequality that has dealt with hundreds of years of unpaid labor, followed by sharecropping, followed by differential wages, followed by being locked out of labor unions for so long, having the cost of college skyrocket because the states are no longer funding them, and having the ability to pay for it being changed, the dynamics of that being changed by an ideological bent that says education really is about the individual. It's not about any kind of benefit to society. So why would society then provide all of these grants? That massive shift in funding, plus plus you're also having the assault in 1977 on affirmative action. So affirmative action began in 1970. By 77, you have the Bakke decision. And what the US Supreme Court says with Bakke is that affirmative action cannot be used as a means of redress of previous racial discrimination. And so it has to be for an educational purpose where you say that diversity has some educational purpose. And so now you have these universities trying to scramble because they can clearly document how they discriminated against Black folks' admissions. That is so clear. It is so clear. It's, Texas, yes. Georgia, yes. Alabama, yes. Mississippi, yes. They can document how they blocked African Americans from being able to go to those universities, those state-funded universities.
Yeah. You actually kind of tiptoeing there into an area here that I wanted to get into. The current climate, if you will, especially as it relates to, critical race theory, and now this, I don't even want to say assault. It's just beyond an assault now on DEI. So the policy making issues around critical race theory, immigration, policing, all of that. How do you see white rage influencing that?
Oh, that's white rage. I mean,
That's what it is.
that's white rage. I mean,
Yeah.
so when Christopher Rufo says, okay, what I'm going to call this is critical race theory. Now, the things that we're calling critical race theory aren't critical race theory, but it has the elements in there that we know most folk don't like. It has critical race and theory. And so we're going to, everything that we don't like, everything dealing with race, everything dealing with equality, we're going to call critical race theory and say that that's a bad, bad thing. We're going to get that out into the universe, make that the norm, that critical race theory is a bad, bad thing. It's indoctrination. It is teaching your children to hate America. It is teaching them to be guilty. And so when we say that, what we're doing is we're using the power of policy to strip real learning, to strip real critical thinking, to strip engagement. So it is what allowed Florida to talk about the benefits of slavery, so that the enslaved, they learned skills. What? Benefits? Benefits? Really?
Right.
So that becomes the education, because that real critical engagement of thinking through what does a system look like. So it sanitizes what has happened to Black folk. And it's sanitizing what happens to Black folk. Then it makes what we see happening to Black folk now being an individual issue. There must be something wrong with the choices that they made, instead of a systemic inequality issue where the system has to be repaired. The system has to be fixed. The system that creates those injustices needs to be examined. And so part of what we're seeing is the backlash. When you think about 2020, yes, in 2020, you had the murder of George Floyd. And then you had a nationwide protest movement because folks were like, oh, this is not my America. This is not the America I know. Oh my God, did you see that cop just killing that man and knowing that he's being recorded, and he didn't care.
Didn't care.
Didn't care. It just was so shocking to so many folk that they were like, oh no, we have to have a better America. We have to live up to our ideals. And then you have folks trying to figure out how we got here, how we got to have a Derek Chauvin, how we got to have a George Floyd being murdered on the streets. How did that happen? And so you saw in that summer not only did you see massive protests, but you also saw people hunger for the knowledge. And so the New York Times bestseller list that summer were full of books dealing with race, racism, and white supremacy. People reading, and understanding. And then you had, remember, we're in the midst of COVID. And we're in 2020, we also had that election where we have an avowed white supremacist running for the office of president to get reelected. And it was that massive turnout by Black folk, by Indigenous folk, by Latinos, and by Asian Americans, and by whites, and by poor people and young people.
Yeah.
That flipped that knocked that white supremacist out of the White House. The response has been white rage on multiple valences about the going after the right to vote. So Georgia looked at every method that African Americans use to access the ballot box and drafted SB 202 to help shut down or create additional obstacles to those methods. Again, you look at the education that was happening as people were hungry for the knowledge. So you get massive book bans happening right now. You're getting laws basically charging or saying that librarians can be charged with a crime for having banned books on their shelves. Wow. You're having teachers being kicked out, fired for teaching the realities of slavery and Jim Crow or teaching the Holocaust.
Right.
So this is what white rage looks like.
Wow. I mean, with this backdrop, these continuous reckonings, after the Civil War, after the Civil Rights Act, and now today, what gives you hope for change?
The backlash would not be there unless we were fighting for our equality. And as we fight for our equality, we keep moving just an inch further closer to what that equality looks like.
Yeah.
That's what gives me the hope. So when King talked about bending the moral arc of the universe, that's what that battle is about.
Okay. Currently, your career has you in Georgia, which is probably, the most watched state in this upcoming election. What lessons do you think the young people of color can learn from history to protect their right to vote?
Use it. Absolutely use it. Again, because politicians have to pay attention to those who are voting. Yeah. This is why you had the massive disfranchisement coming out of the rise of Jim Crow. In Mississippi, there were more Black men registered to vote than there were white men in 1890.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. The Mississippi state legislature looked up at that and said, I mean, there was like Fred Sanford, Liz back? No. And then wrote these massive disfranchising laws, the Mississippi Plan of 1890, to figure out how do we get rid of all of these Black men. Because they knew that those Black men voting had massive political power that could change the dynamics in Mississippi.
Yeah. Wow. Interestingly, this morning I was watching the news and they were going over some polling information for the election, and I heard this before, and I keep hearing it more and more. And actually, I even know some people that fit this demographic. How do you explain they basically were saying, Trump is getting more support from African American males this cycle than what Biden got. And I shouldn't say than what Biden got, but the numbers are shifting. And same thing with Latino voters. And that Harris was, what did they say? She was getting more white vote, if you will, than what Biden got, at least from the polls. So how would you explain that phenomenon is coming out in the polls right now? Don't know if it'll bear fruit in the election, but at least that's what they're saying now.
Part of what I'm seeing with Trump is the kind of allure that he brings, and I hate using that word with Trump because Trump allure is that he has that aura of the self-made man. I'm a billionaire and I'm really smart, and look at the empire that I have built with my genius. And that becomes really attractive to folks who are basically told that they are dependent on government, because that is part of the lie. This Democratic Party's plantation. So you prove your independence by not being on the plantation.
Mm-hmm.
And you prove your strength by aligning with somebody who appears to be self-made. But what that story doesn't tell is that his daddy gave him $400 million.
Right.
So I'm like looking at these black men going, did your daddy give you 400 million?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's a very different kind of self-made.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's also the reality of he's not a successful businessman. He's had
Right.
6 bankruptcies, including bankrupting a casino. The
Mm-hmm.
ability to bankrupt a casino is unheard of, unheard of.
Right.
Um, and the thing is that the show The Apprentice is that's where they crafted the image of him as being very successful.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it is like the Wizard of Oz.
Mm-hmm.
I am the great Wizard of Oz. And then you go
Right.
look behind the curtain and daggone it, there's Donald Trump.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not the great Wizard of Oz at all.
Mm-hmm.
But it is that allure that is so seductive, that sense of being self-made, that a sense of being independent. And let's face it, Kamala Harris is a woman. And what Trump plays to is misogyny.
Mm-hmm.
And he plays to that kind of sense of a really toxic patriarchy, toxic masculinity. And that also is really attractive to a small strata of men.
Mm-hmm.
And so that also becomes part of the lure. Self-made and women.
Mm-hmm.
Who
Mm-hmm.
does she think she is? Right? So
Yeah.
you've got that blending in there.
You just made me think of something, and I think it bore fruit in Michigan, if you believe the exit polls, that, basically if Hillary had won Michigan, she could have won the election. And they blame her losing Michigan on the African American woman vote. Um, how do you see the black women voting this cycle?
So let me just deal with that in
Hmm.
general.
Hmm.
One of the reasons I wrote the book, One Person, No Vote, that deals
Hmm.
with the issue of voter suppression, the history of voter suppression in America, and looking at those various methods, um, is that the pundits were saying, well, the reason we got Donald Trump is because black people just didn't vote. And black people
Right.
didn't vote because they couldn't stand Hillary. And so in there, I got the sense of racism and misogyny all in that one encapsulated
Mm-hmm.
analysis. No, Donald Trump became president not because black folks didn't vote. We
Hmm.
didn't vote for him. We weren't the ones who put him in power. We didn't do that.
True that.
And so the other piece is that this was the first presidential election in 50 years without the protection of the Voting Rights Act.
Mm.
And
Okay.
so you had these states putting in these measures to stop black people from voting. And so in the 2016 election, black voter turnout went down by 7%.
Mm.
When you think how tight those margins were,
Hmm.
particularly in these swing states,
Hmm.
voter suppression did its job.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, no, definitely I'm looking at it. So gosh, I feel like we're such gloom and doom in this conversation. So
Uh-uh.
what are some success stories or examples from previous elections where community of colors, particularly the youth, overcame voter suppression to make their voices heard, and how can we sort of inspire that action today?
So there's so many stories.
Hmm.
One is in the 2017 special election for U.S. Senator between Judge Roy Moore
Hmm.
and Doug Jones.
Yeah.
Doug Jones, who took on the Klan, who had bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church and killed those 4 little girls. And the polls basically said, and Judge Roy Moore was a toxic candidate. He had been kicked off the Alabama Supreme Court twice for violating the rules. He was a known, basically, he liked little girls. He liked young girls. And
Hmm.
so he'd been banned from the mall. When a grown man gets banned from a mall,
Wow.
well,
Yeah.
but the poll showed that he was going to be the winner. Alabama had deployed every method of voter suppression against its Black population: felony disfranchisement, voter ID laws, poll closures, just
Mm-hmm.
whatever you could think, voter roll purges. Alabama had done it.
Mm-hmm.
Grassroots organizations, including the HBCUs,
Mm-hmm.
students at the HBCUs and the Divine Nine, they were like, son, you don't know our names. And Black
Mm-hmm.
Voters Matter, all those organizations, the NAACP youth, they all got in there and everybody did their part in getting those who had felony convictions, getting them registered to vote, because they had fought so hard to have, Alabama had said in 1901, its Jim Crow Constitution said, if you have committed a crime of moral turpitude, you have lost your right to vote. But
Mm-hmm.
Alabama refused to define moral turpitude. So you didn't know whether your burglary conviction would be a moral turpitude thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you voted, then you're going to go back to jail. What?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was
Mm-hmm.
designed to depress the voter turnout rate, particularly the Black voter turnout rate. They
Mm-hmm.
had pressed hard, and by 2017, they had forced Alabama to define moral turpitude: rape,
Okay.
murder, treason.
Okay.
Then they turned to the Secretary of State and said, great, all of those folk that you told they couldn't vote, tell them they got their voting rights back. He said, oh, I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that's a good use of state resources.
What?
Right.
Wow.
Ooh. So you had grassroots organizations doing the work. They started advertising on social media. They started advertising on the radio, and set up what they called restoration clinics in the churches and in mobile units going into poor Black neighborhoods, where they
Mm-hmm.
had a team of lawyers going through the records, you know, not moral turpitude, not moral turpitude, not, and then they had a team of volunteers getting these folks, these returning citizens, registered to vote.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You had another group that was driving folks to and from the polls. You had another group that was registering folks on their college campuses to vote.
Mm-hmm.
You had them doing all of that work. And I remember as the results were coming in, you had folks who were going into the jails because Alabama's law allows people to vote absentee if they are in jail but have not been convicted.
Okay.
So they got them registered to vote in jail, doing
Mm-hmm.
that work. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people registered to vote. I
Now, has
re-
that since been overturned?
Not yet, not that I
Okay.
know of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying I wouldn't be shocked. Yeah.
Right,
Okay.
right, because this is the way white rage works, right? But
Mm-hmm.
what happened was
Mm-hmm.
I remember the returns coming in and it was red, 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 and then there was the blue dot of Huntsville.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was red. And then I remember on Twitter, what was then Twitter, Bernice King,
Mm-hmm.
Martin Luther King's daughter, she tweeted, Selma, Lord Selma. Selma came in hard and strong and just knocked Roy Moore like, what happened there? And then Birmingham hit and Montgomery hit.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that I wrote in One Person No Vote is that there weren't enough white evangelical Christian votes to get Judge Roy Moore off the mat,
Mm-hmm.
because and it was that massive Black voter turnout that
Mm-hmm.
stopped that horrific candidate from becoming a U.S. senator.
Right, right.
That's a victory.
Absolutely, absolutely. Gosh, we're getting close, almost out of time here. Two more things I wanted to ask you about.
Uh-huh.
You recently became the president of the American Philosophical Society, APS, which most is considered the most learned society in America. It was founded by Benjamin Franklin, who was a slave owner, but turned abolitionist. So, what does APS do today, in regards to social justice?
Well, I just got nominated. I just got, inducted into the APS. And
Okay.
so what it does today, I really can't answer.
Hmm. Okay,
Yeah.
that's fair. Well, we'll have to have you back another time to talk about that.
Okay.
But in closing, it's ironic that I'm talking to you today. We actually have a upcoming podcast. I want to say this. Well, we're talking now, but it's going to actually air this week with Noemi Perez of the Immokalee Foundation about their career pathways program for Latino students.
Mhm.
And when I was just doing some research before I talked to you, I saw that you did some work with the around the human rights abuses suffered by the migrant farm workers in Immokalee.
Mhm.
So for our listeners who didn't hear this podcast by the time this one airs, so can you sort of set the stage for what was happening in Immokalee with the migrant farm workers?
Oh, yes. So you had the tomato growers who
Mhm.
were just basically treating the workers as if they were enslaved. And in fact, slavery was happening in the tomato fields.
Mm.
Um, they would take folks and they would put them in these trucks at night and basically shackle them. And there was a bucket where they could use the restroom in these trucks. Yeah, I mean, it was
Wow.
awful. It was awful. And they weren't being paid. Of course, they weren't being paid. And
Hmm.
so the coalition of Immokalee workers started organizing, organizing, organizing. And what they realized was trying to get to these growers, but getting to the folks who were buying those tomatoes,
Mm.
yeah, yeah. And so they started working with like McDonald's and
Hmm.
Walmart and
Hmm.
Burger King because those were the folks buying the tomatoes. And so if you could ensure that there was not sexual violence happening to create those tomatoes, to pick those tomatoes, or slavery happening to create those, pick those tomatoes, and that they were being paid a decent wage for each bucket of tomatoes that they were able to pick.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
folks, and so it was having those fair food standards. And so when McDonald's signed off on, we're going to have fair food standards to make sure that the tomatoes that we use at our restaurants don't
Mm.
have these human rights violations attached to them. It was a game changer in Immokalee.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is, I mean, I also was just recently speaking with some folks out in Washington State. Same thing, not the human rights, but the migrant farm workers that are there and the programs that are being set up for the children of these people that are, U.S. citizens, but helping them along their career paths, whether it be, getting a trade or going to college. So um, yeah, we didn't even touch on that when we talked. It's wow, it's sad to know that that exists. I think it's one of those things that happen in this country that nobody knows about. So hopefully, we can bring a light to it. Hey, I just want to thank you for your time and give you the last word to our youth voters. If you could offer them some advice, what would you say?
Make sure you register to vote. Make sure you have a plan to vote because your incredible voice matters. You have the power to change the dynamics in this society. You have the power to end gun violence. You have the power to bring about affordable education. You have the power to bring about accessible, really good healthcare. You have enormous power. Wield your power. You you've got the power. Do it.
Mm. All right. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.